In May 1607, a small group of would-be settlers arrived by ship from England to establish a small community in Virginia along the James River. The settlement was eventually named Jamestown. After a few weeks, the ships left the colony alone and returned to England to bring news of the new settlement. This would encourage more people to migrate to the New World. The isolated group would have terrible fortunes during the first winter. This was known as the Starving Time, during which approximately 100 colonists died from disease and starvation. Additionally, the small group was in constant threat from the local Indian tribes. George Percy, leader of the colony, would write about the dire conditions. And now, famine began to look ghastly and pale in every face, that nothing was spared to maintain life and to do those things which seemed incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of graves and to eat them. And some have licked up the blood which hath fallen from their weak fellows. It appeared that the colony was destined to fail until a second group of ships arrived with new colonists. Were it not for the efforts of Pocahontas, daughter of a local Indian chief, just a few years later, they would not have survived. During the next 40 years, the settlements had grown exponentially with the addition of groups arriving from England and the population explosion from the local birth rate among colonists. By 1640, the population had grown to more than 5,000. It is during this time that the Kings arrived in Virginia. Although no records are available, it is believed that the immigration of the Kings began in Scotland with a family named MacGregor, who traveled from England to Virginia. Whether fleeing to the New World for criminal reasons or religious persecution, the MacGregors felt it necessary to change their family name prior to arrival. The adopted name was common and easily accepted. The new name was King. Henry King was born in 1657 on the Isle of Wight, Surry County, Virginia, less than 100 miles inland from the Jamestown settlement. Like most early pioneers, Henry was a farmer settling along the southern bank of the James River. It appears that Henry was a prosperous farmer growing corn. In late 1676, at 19 years old, he married Elizabeth Catherine Clark, whose parents were first-generation settlers in the new colony. Their family began on January 26, 1677, when John Mills King was born. It appears that the couple had no other children, as Elizabeth Clark would not live long. Elizabeth was only 30 years old when she died of unknown causes. After her death, it does not appear that Henry remarried. He lived until 1743, never leaving Surry County. Henry outlived his only son, John, by 2 years, dying at 82 years old. John grew up on his family's farm, remaining through his mid-30s. At 39 years old, John Mills King married Hannah House on August 12, 1716. Hannah was 23 years his junior, and the couple had 9 children. His marriage came late in life, and there is no record of a first wife. John was a farmer in Bristol County, adjacent to the Isle of Wight. He died on January 19, 1741, at 64 years old, in the same area where he was born. John would carry the title captain most of his life, although it is not clear if or when he served in the Virginia militia. There were no major battles during any practical time of service, but Indians inhabiting the Virginia territory would be a constant threat, requiring communities to organize and train soldiers for protection. As a captain, John was required to train and maintain a local militia. The fourth-born child to John and Hannah was John Mills King Jr., born in Bristol Parish on August 22, 1724. He grew up on his father's farm with 6 brothers and 3 sisters. In December 1746, John Jr. married Mary Margaret Powell, who lived for just 10 years after the marriage. The couple had 4 children. In 1748, he purchased 238 acres in Surry County, Virginia, for 25 shillings or just over $1,000 today. Shortly after Mary's death, John Mills married Hannah Davis. Hannah was born in August 1730, 6 years younger than John. The couple would have 5 more children. In 1754, war erupted between the French and British across the world. This larger conflict extended to the territories in the New World, including Virginia. A 22-year-old officer named George Washington organized the local Virginia militias. The war was later known as the French and Indian War, lasting almost 9 years. By April 1757, Virginia passed an act for the better regulating and disciplining the militia. This act empowered local Virginia farm owners to create and develop their own local militias. Be it further enacted by the authority aforesaid, that every captain shall once in 3 months, and oftener if thereto required by the lieutenant or commanding officer in the county, muster, train, and exercise his company, and the lieutenant or other chief commanding officer in the county shall cause a general muster and exercise of all companies within his county to be made in the months of March or April, and in September or October yearly. The French were severely outnumbered and soon allied with a number of Indian tribes, and the fighting escalated. A roster of colonial officers from 1732 to 1774 lists John King as one of the officers in Washington's district. Although it is not certain, it appears that John Jr. was part of the Virginia militia serving under Washington. During the latter stages of the war, a mass migration occurred from more developed northern colonies to the south. This became known as the Great Wagon Road. The actual road provided means of travel specifically to the Carolinas and Georgia along the Appalachian Mountains. As a result, the population of the North Carolina backcountry exploded. One of the prominent groups to travel to Carolina were Scottish immigrants. Historian Brenda E. McPherson Compton wrote about this. The heavily traveled Great Wagon Road was the primary route for the early settlement of the southern United States, particularly the backcountry. Although a wide variety of settlers traveled southward on the road, 2 dominant cultures emerged. The German Palatines and Scottish immigrants arrived in huge numbers because of the bloody religious conflicts and persecution of the Protestants by monarchies in Great Britain and Europe. The Scottish made up a substantial portion of the Continental Army and state militia in the American War of Independence. They went on to form what became the backbone of Appalachian culture. This would help describe some of the motivation for the King's family to relocate. By 1759, John Mills Jr. and family moved south to Orange County, North Carolina, near Chapel Hill. Land grants were being given to encourage settlers to endure the arduous journey. Although no documentation was found, John Jr. likely received a land grant in the Chapel Hill area. In his will executed in May 1782, John bequeathed his estate to his wife and son, William Nathaniel, contingent upon his death. On August 17, that same year, John Mills Jr. died in Chapel Hill, Orange County, North Carolina. John Jr. spent the last 23 years of his life there. His second wife, Hannah, died in 1801, 19 years after her husband. During the final years of the Revolutionary War, the Cherokee Nation had allied with the British. In early 1782, the North Carolina militia initiated what would be called the Cherokee Campaign. The military set out to invade the Indian Territory located in what was called the Back Country. It is not clear if John Jr. participated, as he was 58 years old. However, the campaign fell in perfect timing with John Jr.'s death, and his military experience would have been heavily valued. Such participation seems speculative, as the documentation is limited and no reference to his involvement was found. It is strange that in May he created his will, settling his estate as if his death was imminent. Perhaps he was sick or leaving for military duty with the militia. John Jr.'s son, Baxter King, fought with the North Carolina militia, making it likely that Baxter participated in the Cherokee Campaign. This adds to the argument that John Jr. was also involved. James Willis King was first born to John Mills King Jr. and his first wife, Margaret. James was born in Bristol Parish, Virginia, on February 14, 1746, just a few years before the extended family's migration to North Carolina. Valentine's Day has a sordid history of saints and martyrs going back as far as the 2nd century. By the 1700s, February 14th was widely celebrated in the colonies as loved ones frequently exchanged cards and gifts. James would always be remembered as the family's Valentine's baby. James Willis was an adolescent when he traveled with his family to North Carolina. At 34 years old, he married Sarah Spain in Wake County in 1780. That same year, on April 11th, he received a land grant of 300 acres on both sides of Briar Creek in Wake County near Raleigh. Like the rest of his family, James Willis was a farmer. It appears the couple had 7 children. Robert Newell King was the 5th born child in 1791 in Wake County, North Carolina. The 1790 census was the first taken after the adoption of the United States Constitution in 1789. This census counted farm workers, free and slaves. James lists 3 workers. It is unclear if these were free or slaves. James and Sarah would farm in Wake County their entire lives. Unfortunately, James would not live to see the new century, dying in 1799 at 53 years old. Sarah would die the next year. Her age could not be determined. James' will, executed in February 1799, includes 6 children who are very young. On October 28, 1819, at 28 years old, Robert Newell King married Lavinia Horton in Wake County, North Carolina. Robert had received a 100-acre land grant in Greene County on the Nolichucky River, where he built and operated a farm. The couple had 10 children during the next 23 years. After the birth of their final child, Robert, Lavinia, and 5 children migrated to Oconee County, South Carolina. In an article written by Tommy W. Rogers titled The Great Population Exodus from South Carolina, 1850 to 1860, discussed reasons for the movement of farmers to the West. Rogers emphasized 2 related factors: the relocation of the cotton industry with the development of railroads, and the loss of productivity in the soil in South Carolina with hundreds of years of planting without soil preservation. With this outmigration, opportunities were available to new farmers. During the time around 1850, Robert Newell and family relocated to a sparsely populated farm community around Long Nose Falls near Townville. The 1850 census shows Robert and Lavinia living in the Western Division of Anderson District with 5 children. Robert Canaday was the oldest at 17 and Melvina the youngest at 6. Robert Newell had established his farm, recording the value at $150. He could neither read nor write. For the first time, the 1850 census showed the younger children attending school. The 1860 census shows the family in Townville in Anderson County. Their farm has grown in value from $150 to $400 in 10 years. Robert Newell's son, George Lucas King, who went by the name Lucas, was listed as a laborer living separate but adjacent to Robert Newell's farm. Lucas was 25 years old, living with his wife Lena and son Charles. Lena was 17. Robert Kennedy King traveled with his family to South Carolina at 15 years old. He worked on his family farm and did not attend school, reaching adulthood around 1853, and began working at Bachelor's Retreat in the southern section of what was then Pickens County. Bachelor's Retreat was a Presbyterian community of exclusive residents. It was there that he met Eliza Newell in 1854. They were soon married and settled in Horseshoe in the same area. The 1860 census shows the family living on a farm with no stated value. Robert Kennedy's personal estate was $80. The couple had 3 children. It appears this poor family was renting a farm which was adjacent to a large plantation owned by C.P. Poole. Poole lists the farm's value at $10,000, well over $1 million today. The landlord was named Claiborne Petty Poole and appears to be connected with the Bachelor's Retreat. In early 1861, war was brewing in South Carolina. Many would enlist in the cause. It is probable that few soldiers from Pickens County had a personal stake in the ideology. As with most struggles, those who benefit the least are counted on the most. The Robert Newell King family would offer 4 of their sons. None would survive. Robert Kennedy's life as a farmer would be short-lived. On July 20th, 1861, he enlisted in Colonel Orr's 1st South Carolina Rifles Infantry as a private. Robert was 28 years old. C.P. Poole's 3 sons also fought in the Civil War. His oldest son, Bayless Earl, fought with Robert Kennedy as a sergeant in Orr's 1st Regiment. He died on January 18, 1862, from sickness on Sullivan's Island, guarding the Charleston port. Robert Kennedy survived almost 1 year from Bayless' death. So close were these friends that Robert named his youngest son, born in April 1861, Bayless Earl. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union in December 1860. Other states would soon follow. The first battle at Fort Sumter was fought in April of 1861, just 4 months later. Fort Sumter was a Union-controlled fort with a small garrison stationed there. The newly formed Confederate government had given an ultimatum to the Union to evacuate the fort. By April, the garrison was in desperate need of resupply. South Carolina warned that a supply ship entering the port of Charleston would be viewed as an act of war. On April 12th, the supply ship entered the waters surrounding Charleston. The Confederates responded by bombarding the fort. The actual battle damaged the fort, but the only casualty was a Union battery officer, and the death was self-inflicted as a fort cannon exploded. After a ceasefire, the rest of the garrison was evacuated to the north, and the severely damaged fort was abandoned. For 29 years, tension was boiling in South Carolina, starting with the Nullification Act in 1832. By the time of the Fort Sumner battle, Southerners were anxious to fight. War was declared, and many states followed in secession. President Lincoln sent out an order for 75,000 enlistments. The Confederacy also organized armies from each state. After refusing the appointment of general in charge of the Union armies, Robert E. Lee became commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. After this buildup, the first battle appeared imminent. Both armies approached from opposite directions at Manassas Junction in Northern Virginia, just 30 miles from Washington, D.C. It wasn't until Saturday, July 21, 1861, that the soldiers were in position. Sunday morning, the Union initiated attacks on a number of fronts. Spectators from Washington, D.C. leisurely brought their carriages to the battlefield to witness the expected Union victory. The well-entrenched Confederates had concentrated their defenses around Henry Hill, holding the high ground. The Union attacks initially progressed, but by 3 p.m., the attacks faltered as General Jackson counterattacked and broke the standoff. The poorly trained Union soldiers fled in panic. The chaos that ensued combined soldiers and civilians in a mass disorganized retreat. The South was also very disorganized and unable to take advantage of their victory. Prior to the first battle, most thought the war would last just a few months. After the battle, it was clear that the war would not be a short one. Both sides quickly retreated to organize and train. The next land engagement would not occur until the spring of 1862. Robert Kennedy King enlisted with South Carolina's first recruits. Colonel Orr organized the 1st Rifle Infantry, which mustered into Confederate service on July 20, 1861, just 2 days before the Battle of Bull Run. Soon, the regiment deployed to Fort Moultrie at the southern tip of Sullivan's Island in December 1861. Moultrie was an important fort protecting the Charleston port. In April 1862, they were assigned to General Lee's army and relocated to Virginia with more than 1,000 men. These units participated in most of the hottest battles in General Lee's army, including Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. Throughout the early part of the war, President Lincoln dismissed a number of generals. In early 1862, George McClellan had begun his Peninsula Campaign, which attacked Confederate strongholds from south to north around Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. By November 1862, General Ambrose Burnside was the next short-lived appointee. After the battle in Antietam in Northern Virginia, Burnside attempted to flank Lee's army to the south and outrace him to Richmond. The entire plan depended on pontoon bridges to enable the army to cross the broad Rappahannock River. The Union Army was soon positioned and sent for the bridges. November gave way to December, and still the bridges had not arrived. By this time, the Confederates were well entrenched in the border town across the river. The strategy of a surprise attack engaging a small part of Lee's army was now lost with the deployment of 75,000 Confederates. It wasn't until December 11th that the Union Army was in a position to cross the river. The battle persisted for 2 days, with each army breaking lines. By December 13th, the battle lines were drawn and the Union attempted to assault the town of Fredericksburg. Robert's unit was positioned in reserve, attached to General A.P. Hill's army, protecting the northern flank. During the battle, Stonewall Jackson, as he had done before, counterattacked from Hill's left, flanking Union General Reynolds, who was protecting the Union's opposite right flank. Reynolds was quickly overwhelmed. This created what became known as the Slaughter Pen. Robert's unit moved to the north of their position to engage with Jackson's attack and took advantage of the hilly terrain to support the right flank. After a long and protracted battle in which 5,000 casualties were inflicted, Burnside ordered a retreat. It appears that after Burnside's retreat, the South Carolina 1st Infantry also retreated to rest. The Civil War in the East described what happened next. The regiment lost 170 men when Federal troops broke through the lines and surprised the South Carolinians resting under stacked arms. Lieutenant Colonel Norton was wounded, losing his left arm, and Captain James T. Robertson was also wounded. General Gregg was killed, and Samuel McGowan took over the brigade. According to family, Robert was resting under a tree, reading, and was shot by a sniper. Robert's death left Eliza, his widow, with 5 young children, the youngest only 16 months old. She continued to live on the farm in the retreat community, adjacent to Poole's plantation. Eliza Newell King had an extremely hard time providing and raising her children during the remaining war years. This intensified during the after years until her children were old enough to help with the farming. Her efforts were rewarded with the character of her children as they matured, well respected in their communities. She instilled in them a respect for work and a strong faith in God. There seems to be some discrepancy in the birth dates of Eliza's 2 final children, as Roxana and Samuel's birth dates fall after Robert's death in 1862. In fact, Samuel's gravestone seems to authenticate the later date. A family narrative written years later indicates that Eliza and Robert had 5 children before his untimely death. And Robert's death is well documented. There is mention in the records of a character named Robert Earl with very little data. But Eliza's family is consistent in future censuses as she is a widow and not remarried. The 2 youngest children are included with the later dates. These dates are consistent as well as their location. By the time of Robert's death, there were a large group of kings. I have verified that no children matching the descriptions of Roxana or Samuel were part of the brothers and sisters' families. Samuel George, or George Samuel, had an interesting life as a timber appraiser in Georgia. His obituary in the Atlanta Constitution seems to authenticate both the later date and the family history. George Samuel, 64, formerly one of the best-known timber appraisers in the South, died in his home yesterday. He had spent the last 2 years trying to recuperate from ill health. King is survived by his widow and 2 brothers, James King of Pendleton, South Carolina, and William King of Fitzgerald. The Robert Newell King family was well represented in the Civil War. Robert's brothers, Lewis Jefferson, John Hester, and George Lucas, were all killed. Lewis Jefferson King died on January 14, 1862 in Charlottesville. John Hester King appears to have died of pneumonia 5 days after his brother Robert. George Lucas King enlisted on March 19, 1862, as a private in the South Carolina 2nd Regiment Rifles. According to family, George died on June 19, 1864 in Petersburg, Virginia. There is some dispute as to the place or the date. The siege in Petersburg did not begin until December 1864, lasting until March 1865. It seems unlikely that he was killed before the armies arrived. This death toll would weigh heavy on the family as they attempted to survive the aftermath of the war. By the 1880 census, Eliza had moved to Tougaloo in Oconee County, operating a small farm with 3 children. William, 24 years old, was a farm laborer, and Roxana, 13, was attending school. The youngest child, Samuel George, was just 7 years old. In the 1900 census, Eliza, 64 years old, was living with her youngest son, Samuel George, in a rented home in Tougaloo. George, 26 years old, was a day laborer. It appears that Roxana had died, as Eliza had only 4 living children. On September 11, 1903, Eliza died in her home. The Kiwi Courier reported that Eliza was a faithful member of the Baptist Church, lived a godly life, and died a triumphant death. She was bedridden for nearly 1 year prior to her death. Eliza's third son, Bayless Earl, married Sarah Dodd in 1880, and the couple had 7 children. The family soon moved to Big Smith in Franklin County, Georgia, where Bayless rented a small farm. Bayless' wife Sarah was born on September 3, 1857 in Pickens County. She was 4 years older than Bayless. Like him, she also grew up on a farm. The couple farmed their whole lives. Bayless Earl King died in Tougaloo, South Carolina on September 5, 1928 at 67 years old. Sarah lived 20 years after her husband's death. William L. King was second born to Robert Kennedy and Eliza. Like his brothers, William was a farmer, also moving to Franklin, Georgia, where he married Malifa Cox in 1885. George died in Ben Hill, Georgia on January 18, 1938, 10 years after his brother. James Austin King was the family's oldest child, born December 12, 1854. James grew up farming with his mother, Eliza. He was just 7 years old when his father, Robert Kennedy, died. In 1876, James Austin married Martha Elmina Dodd, who was Sarah Dodd's older sister. James was also 4 years younger than Martha. In the 1880 census, James was farming adjacent to Ira Dodd's farm. Ira was Martha's father. By then, the couple had 2 children, Florence 3 and Julia 2. In 1880, Ira was 60 years old. It appears that James was farming on his father-in-law's farm. In the 1860 agricultural census, Ira was renting a medium-sized farm growing corn. James Austin and Martha Elmina had 6 children in their first 15 years, 4 girls and 2 boys. Martha was 44 years old when her last child was born. Her father, Ira, died in 1903. By that time, James and Martha had moved to Williamston in Anderson County. The 1900 census showed the family living in a rented house. James and 3 children worked at the town cotton mill. By 1910, the couple was farming again, having moved to Central in Pickens County, with the youngest 2 children still living with them. James was 57 years old. Martha Elmina died on June 19, 1933, at 85 years old. The Greenville News recorded that she was a member of Fants Grove Baptist Church. James outlived her by 7 years. At the time of her death, the couple would have celebrated 58 years of marriage. She is buried with her husband in the church's cemetery. James Austin King died on October 19, 1940. He was living with his oldest daughter Florence and her family in Seneca. James was buried with his wife in the Fants Grove Baptist Church Cemetery. Although he spent some years in town, he had farmed most of his life. Robert Ellis King was 4th born to James Austin and Martha Elmina on August 11, 1885. Like most of his relatives, he grew up on his father's farm. He learned to read and write, but did not attend school. At 14, he began working in the Williamston cotton mill as a dolpher. Children were employed in the mills as spinners, sweepers, and dolphers, with girls usually starting out as spinners and boys as dolphers and sweepers. When the bobbins on the spinning frames were full, the machinery stopped. The dolphers would swarm into the mill and as quickly as possible change all the bobbins, after which the machinery would be restarted, and the dolphers were free to amuse themselves until the next changeover. In 1905, Robert married Texie Anna Alexander, who was just 16 years old. Texie Anna was born on May 18, 1889, and was 4 years younger than her husband. The couple had 8 children in the next 14 years. On September 18, 1819, Robert Ellis registered for the World War I draft. His service was not required as the war ended just 2 months later. The couple had continued to have children during the previous decade, and on August 27, 1920, Grady Ansell was born. Unbeknownst to Robert and Texie, Grady would be their last child. On January 9, 1924, Texie Anna died unexpectedly. The cause of her death appears to be a severe condition, which is now described as hyperemesis gravidarum, or HG, a severe nausea and emesis noted during pregnancy. In Texie Anna's situation, this nausea and vomiting led to her death. She was 34 years, 9 months, and 13 days old when she passed. Funeral services were held at Tabor Baptist Church. The couple had lived on their farm in Tougaloo. Just 1 year after Texie Anna's death, Robert Ellis married again. Prior to her marriage, Obera Myers, often called Vera, was living with her aunt, Anna Lamb, in Walhalla. Vera was working as a spinner in the cotton mill with her cousin Viola. Vera was born on November 8, 1903, 18 years younger than Robert Ellis. The couple would have 3 more children in the next years. Robert and Vera lived in Tougaloo for the next 20 years, farming and raising their children. By the 1950 census, they had moved to Greenville, where Robert and Vera worked as clerks in a retail store. Robert Ellis was 64 and Obera was 46, and they had 2 children at home. Robert Ellis King died in Greenville on June 1, 1967. He was a member of Refuge Baptist Church in Central South Carolina. He is buried in Memory Gardens near Clemson. Obera Myers King lived 23 more years, dying in Central on Route 1. Also a member of Refuge Baptist Church, she was 80 years old. They are interred together in Memory Gardens. Grady Ansell King was born on August 27, 1920. His mother, Texie Anna, died just 3 years later with an unexpected pregnancy-related death. Grady grew up on his father's farm in Tougaloo. By the 1940 census, Grady was living in Greenville with 2 brothers. Homer and his wife, Bessie, had 2 children living in a rented house on Center Street. Homer was 34 years old and Bessie 28. Each worked at a local cotton mill with Homer as a bench press operator and Bessie as a weaver. Another brother, Dewey, 21 years old, was also living in the home and working as a retail store attendant. Grady was 19 years old and seeking work. Early the next year, Grady Ansell King married Georgia Ann Henderson. Georgia was the 7th of 10 children in the Taylor Henderson family. Taylor was married to Betty Louise Bryant and worked as a dairy herdsman at the Clemson Agricultural College. Prior to her marriage, the 1940 census showed Georgia living at home in Seneca at 22 years old. She had no employment. In 1941, Grady Ansel King married Georgia Ann Henderson in Seneca. Soon, the couple rented a house in Greenville at 11 Summit Street, and Grady began work at People's Bakery as a salesman. Later that year, on December 7th, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. suddenly and eagerly entered the Second World War. Just a little over 2 months later, on February 16, 1942, Grady registered for the draft. He was still employed at People's Bakery, located on the corner of Rutherford and Buncombe. On April 29, 1942, the Greenville News published the names and serial numbers of 2,600 draftees from South Carolina's third draft. Grady was listed with serial number 12,303, but it would be a few years before he was called up. Patricia A. King was born on July 20th, 1942, as the couple's first child. Grady Ansel King Jr. would follow just over 2 years later on October 2nd, 1944. A few months later, Grady Sr. was called to active service. The war was at its apex in June 1944, when the Allies began their conquest of Western Europe. On June 6th, they crossed the Channel from England to Normandy, France, called D-Day. Once the beachhead was achieved, the Germans' defeat was simply a matter of time. By October, the armies were at the doorstep of Germany. Operation Market Garden had failed, and the armies had resorted to the original plan of crossing the Rhine River. The Battle of the Bulge delayed the inevitable, with the Germans surprising the Allies in a desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest. This risky offensive required speed and mobility, attempting to split the armies in a race to the port of Antwerp, the Allies' main distribution center. But after 6 weeks of fighting, the German offensive bogged down and they were forced to retreat. By March 1945, Patton's Third Army had crossed the Rhine River at Remagen, and the sprint to Berlin accelerated with little resistance. The war in Europe would end 2 months later. The Pacific War was a different story. The U.S. landed on the beaches of Okinawa April 1st, 1945. Okinawa was the closest island to the mainland of Japan, and the last island in the U.S. battle plan. Once taken, they would use that location to launch the invasion of the mainland. The Japanese had built a network of tunnels along the ridges in the center of the island. Their strategy was brutal and costly, with no hope of victory, making the U.S. pay for every yard with soldiers' lives. By the end of the battle, more than 12,000 soldiers were killed and 50,000 wounded. The Japanese lost 100,000. The battle lasted more than 2 months. It wasn't until June 22nd that the island was considered secure and the U.S. could set their sights on Japan. Operation Downfall was the code name for the planned invasion. The operation called for 1 million soldiers, many of which were training in the U.S. By late July, hundreds of ships were on the water heading for Japan. The 2 atomic bombs were dropped in early August, forcing the Japanese leaders to surrender, and the carefully planned invasion never happened. Many ships literally stopped and turned around. Grady Sr. went on active duty on February 9, 1945, and he was sent to Fort Jackson in Columbia for basic training lasting 10 weeks. Fort Jackson, adjacent to Columbia, South Carolina, is a 53,000-acre U.S. Army training center. Between 1925 and 1940, it served as an encampment and training area for the South Carolina National Guard. It became a permanent Army garrison in 1940. According to family, Grady Sr. was on a ship serving as a cook. However, the enlistment documents clearly place him in the Army training at Fort Jackson, most likely through April 1945. In a photo after his enlistment, Grady was wearing an Army uniform. The late training date ruled him out of Europe. He most definitely deployed to the Pacific. I could find no evidence of transfers between branches of service. Grady Sr. was most likely part of the invasion force that would participate in Operation Downfall. In June 1945, the U.S. concluded their victory in Okinawa and began staging for an invasion of the Japanese mainland. This invasion was a massive undertaking requiring more than 1 million more soldiers to be trained and transported. It seems likely that Grady Sr. was part of that buildup, shipping to the Pacific Theater after training. As a result, most of the soldiers who deployed to participate in Operation Downfall were on transport ships in the middle of the Pacific and simply turned around and returned home. Grady Sr. described the celebration on his ship, which anchored on a large sandbar in the middle of the ocean. The crew and soldiers disembarked and partied for 2 days. Transports which left early enough to reach their destinations would have been part of the peaceful occupation of the surrendered country. In August 1945, thousands of soldiers landed on the beaches of Japan carrying weapons with no bullets. By the end of 1945, 430,000 soldiers were stationed across Japan. It appears that Grady was part of that peaceful occupation. The country was devastated and in ruins. By the end of the war, the U.S. had bombed all of the strategic cities with a new weapon. In early 1945, the Army introduced a formula called napalm, which became an extremely effective firebomb. Most of the houses in Japan were made of wood and paper. The bombs would create firestorms that would rage through the cities, destroying miles of structures. In some cases, the only thing left standing were the bridges. Wherever he went, Grady would have experienced a country in desperate need of assistance. This experience would certainly shape his life. It is not known how long he was stationed in Japan. In early 1946, many replacement soldiers were being introduced into the country as the occupying army was mustered back to the United States, where many were discharged. At the end of the war, nearly 8 million soldiers were trying to return to the U.S. The military named this massive project Magic Carpet, which was created to systematically send them home. Operation Magic Carpet would continue into mid-1946. For the previous 5 years before the war, Grady had worked at People's Bakery, performing various jobs from sales to delivery. It is likely that he learned to bake during his employment. This skill would have been very handy on a transport ship, especially with a large increase of passengers on the return home. It is plausible that Grady worked in the kitchen, where he demonstrated character and expertise that stood out among his peers. As it is told, a recruiting officer took notice and presented Grady with a proposal that would have him re-enlist and relocate his family to the West Coast or perhaps Hawaii at Uncle Sam's expense. After careful consideration, Grady declined and returned to his home in Greenville. When he finally reached home, he began employment as a delivery driver with Sarietman Biscuit Company. They moved to a house at 124 Sunshine Avenue. The couple had one more child, Robert T. King, in 1948, making a total of 3. By the 1950 census, Grady Sr. was still working at the biscuit company and living in the same house. His pay was $2,750 per year, almost $40,000 today. The 1950s were stable and life seemed easy. But life is full of seasons. Rady Sr. could not have been prepared for the last chapters of his life.